Capitalizing on some of the expertise that we have here in the Penn State Department of Meteorology and Atmospheric Science, we are pleased to welcome back to the show postdoctoral scholar Dr. Jake Carstens, kicking off a brand new segment on Weather World tonight called Tropical Tracker. Jake, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Rob. Happy to be back after a few months away, although I wish it didn't mean hurricane season is right around the corner, but such is the reality.
And such is your research, too. Of course, the hurricane season doesn't officially begin in the Atlantic Basin until June 1st, but the National Hurricane Center has already begun issuing products.
Yeah, so a new wrinkle introduced in the last couple of years in response to a run of 7 years in a row where we had a preseason named storm. And as we kind of pull up our 2023 name list, you might see some recurring favorites, or perhaps the opposite if you're sensible about hurricanes. From our 2017 season is the last time we saw this come up. 4 names that are new to the list, replacing retired storms Harvey, Irma, Maria, and Nate. You see Harold, Idalia, Margot, and Nigel on the list.
And so as we're talking about new wrinkles, there are quite a few new things about this upcoming season.
Yeah, so the National Hurricane Center is always out here trying to issue new products and optimize their forecasting. So we see some new graphical products introduced this year. First of all, our tropical weather outlooks. What you'll see right when you go to hurricanes.gov now extends out to 7 days instead of 5, so trying to get a longer range look at some of those waves coming off of Africa, for example. Also including those Invest ID numbers, the kind of pre-tropical cyclone disturbance identifiers that we use kind of in the research field. The forecast cone, which is updated every year based on track errors over the prior 5 years, is essentially identical, although 2022 had some of the best track forecasts in really the history of the National Hurricane Center. And also one of the things that I'm a big fan of is the consistent expansion of storm surge graphics. The peak storm surge forecast graphic has now become an operational product this year after a couple of years in the experimental stage. And we're also seeing expanded access to storm surge graphics for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands.
As we're looking ahead at this upcoming season, a lot of different entities will issue some of their own seasonal outlooks. How are things looking as we go ahead into the next couple of months?
Yeah, so we'll break down some of the physical justification for all of this in just a little bit here, but I think the expectations for this season are really right around the mean. But there's a lot of variability in here. It's kind of a tricky seasonal forecast compared to some of the La Nina years that we've had from 2020 to 2022. So you see our 1991 to 2020 average of about 14 or 15 named storms or so. I've compiled just a list of some of the universities that issue these seasonal forecasts, and we tend to see somewhere around the mean. Colorado State, one of the most established institutions for issuing seasonal forecasts, led by Philip Klotzbach, is forecasting 13 named tropical storms, including 6 hurricanes and 2 major hurricanes. You see the University of Arizona on the right side is a bit of an outlier, but it really is a bit of a downgrade in terms of expected activity from what we had over the past 3 years, which I'll take as a good sign, of course. And
going back to that list, too, I wanted to mention that when you see hurricanes and major hurricanes, what do we mean when we say major hurricane? So major hurricane just means the category 3 or higher on the Saffir-Simpson scale. This just takes into account the maximum sustained wind of the storm. So you might see some alternative metrics out there like accumulated cyclone energy or integrated kinetic energy. There's some real nerdy stuff out there to try to take into account some of the size of the storm or its duration or various components like that, but this is just referring to how strong are those winds in that eye wall, essentially. So now let's get into some of the nitty-gritty. What are some of the players that are actually as part of those forecasts? I know sea surface temperature plays a big role.
Yeah, so it's really a nuanced science when it comes to the actual storm environment. But when we're looking at this from a climatological perspective, one of the big things that we're focused on is sea surface temperatures. And this can include both in the Atlantic Basin and in other parts of the world here. So I'm showing you this kind of Western hemispheric map, essentially going out even into the Western Pacific Basin, looking at water temperature anomalies. And the big thing that I want you to zoom in on here is that blob of red that's off the coast of South America. And that is a sign of the El Nino that we expect to develop later on this year in a much stronger way here. And what we're talking about with El Nino is just that, warm water over the eastern Pacific Ocean. And this has pretty big ramifications globally. It really increases global temperatures, it influences circulation patterns, and that's really what we're focused on when it comes to the Atlantic Basin. Because you imagine that blob right there, you have a lot of thunderstorm activity with all that warm water, all that energy built up, and the atmospheric response is to basically generate a big old ridge of high pressure right to the north over the subtropical Pacific Ocean with downstream flow that causes this troughing pattern essentially over the Atlantic Ocean. Just imagine a big old trough of low pressure over the Caribbean, over the Western Atlantic. That introduces a lot of wind shear into that part of the basin, and that can be a negative influence on hurricane development and intensity, and a good thing for us that essentially is the justification for why we expect a little bit of a regression in activity from the last couple of years.
And quite a bit in terms of positive sea surface temperature anomalies in the Atlantic basin as well, including the Gulf.
Right, so you notice that those numbers weren't all that low. It's because there's competing factors at play here. So if we kind of zoom in on that temperature map into the Atlantic part of the world specifically, we see this big area of relatively warm water in the central and eastern tropical Atlantic basin, or the so-called main development region. That's where our tropical waves are going to be coming off of Africa in July, August, September. Oftentimes are big candidates for strong long-track hurricanes, and thermodynamically things are looking favorable at this stage of the year for some significant development out there. So basically these two competing factors sort of averaging out to a consensus somewhere in the middle for this season, I would say.
And it's worth noting, too, that we've actually already had our first subtropical storm of the season.
Yeah, so in the last week or two, the National Hurricane Center issued a statement basically saying this frontal system that emerged over the Gulf Stream in the Atlantic back in January actually acquired subtropical characteristics and will be considered an unnamed subtropical storm. So if we actually get our first tropical system of the year, it will get the designation of TD2 instead of TD1.
Yeah, and it wasn't named either, right?
Yeah, so Arlene is still on the table.
Gotcha. Well, Dr. Jay Carstens, thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to having more tropical tracker segments as we go further into the Atlantic hurricane season. We'll be back in just a moment with more.